Oh, I
And if you
bet.
go back and apoplectic, they just, I mean, just like, oh my gosh, because it was one of the most secret programs that the national security and the government had. We're talking one of the most secret. It was more secret than the torture program, right? It was more secret than a number of. I mean, I was part of, right, and there was a huge, a huge national security complex. I became very aware of it, and I was read in on a number of interesting programs, right, to support national security. This was one of the most secret, and they quickly launched a massive leak investigation, a national security leak investigation. And I knew at that time in December 2005 that I would be tagged, no doubt, as a probable source, if not the primary source, of that New York Times article and the two reporters who wrote it, even though I had never gone to the New York Times. And sure enough, I became a significant person of interest and was targeted over a couple of years. And I had gone in the meantime. I made a fateful decision. I own it, but I made the choice. I knew because of what happened to Ellsberg with the Pentagon Papers, the bright and shining lie of Vietnam, which that's a whole nother historical failure. I knew that if I went to the press, there was more than a passing likelihood that I would lose my job or worse and be charged in a similar manner.
Mm-hmm.
But I knew an awful lot was at stake. And in essence, the fourth estate was sort of the last, you talk about touching the third rail. Yeah, going to the fourth estate's touching the third rail. There was going to be blowback for me. Long story in terms of how was I able to, she was being monitored. So this is another thing. Part of there was the PSP was sort of the umbrella program, right? But NSA was the executive agent for it. At NSA, the secret program at the time, the surveillance regime, or you could call it bulk collection, so they preferred to call it to get around sort of mass surveillance, was Stellar Wind. But there was other that was an umbrella, right? There was other programs. One of them actually targeted certain journalists, reporters, and media outlets because they were, in fact, quite afraid of unauthorized leaks regarding a number of things that the Bush administration had engaged in. They did not want the public to know about. So they were hiding a number of things away from the public interest. Now, are there legitimate secrets to keep? Yes, there are legitimate secrets, but those are very, very small in number, like nuclear codes and nuclear technology, things of that nature, troop movements, ship movements, things of in that category, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some kind of larger is certain critical elements of national defense. Yeah, you just don't want anybody, including the public, just knowing about it. And we even there's a whole system involved where you could actually release things that were unclassified that would still reflect, but would not reveal, as we would call it, and when I say we, the royal we, sources and methods. The one thing you always protected were sources and methods. So here I am knowing I've been targeted. So you can imagine this is the spring of 2006. I had been in contact with a reporter anonymously. She didn't even know who I was for another year about all this, but with unclassified information. And I was put under electronic and physical surveillance. I would never want anybody to go through what I do. It reminded me of, going back to the Cold War and certain other regimes in other foreign lands that, end up monitoring their population. Here I was being directly targeted, and I had FBI agents following me around for quite a while, both surreptitiously as well as in later kind of in the open, and plus all kinds of electronic surveillance. You can imagine, here it is, end of November 2007. So this is almost, a year and a half plus later from the time I was targeted. I'm getting ready. At the time, I was teaching at the National Defense University down at Fort McNair, and I was getting ready for work. And I look out the window, and there's all these cars pulling up, and FBI agents streaming out across the front yard, and huge knock at the door, and they're about to bust in. My son opened the door, and they had a warrant. They actually had gone to a magistrate judge in Maryland to get a warrant, and they served it on me, and they rifled, basically turned the house inside out for the next 9 hours. It was the last time that I formally wanted. It was like, well, here's a chance. But they didn't want to hear about any of my whistleblowing. They didn't want to hear about the violation of law. They didn't want to hear about, up to and including the president. All they said is, we're here to collect evidence. And they took just about anything that looked like evidence, books, papers, pretty much everything electronic. There were some funny moments. My original days of computing began with 8-bit computers, home computers. My first computer was an Atari 800, which I still enjoy going back to those days. And they're carrying out my old Atari computers. And I said, and I actually remember the guys coming up from my basement office, and I looked down at him as he's coming up. I said, you really need to take that? That's technology goes back to the late 70s. And he actually looked down at it and said, no, we don't. And he put it back on the shelf. It was just one of those moments.
How did it resolve itself? I mean, it looks like the full force of the government was thrown at you.
We're talking, it turned out, and this is an article in the New York Times in 2010, right? I mean, I just skipped ahead several years. So there was this multi-million-dollar 5 full-time prosecutors, 25 full-time agents. They were pulling FBI agents from their mole hunter unit, which is specifically trained to go after real spies, right? That's how serious they were about me. That's how the level of threat I allegedly posed for the government, and causing we're not just talking regular damage, but the gravest of damage to the national security of the United States. That's the level at which I was targeted because of the New York Times article. So that was revealed in the New York Times in July of 2010. So what happened between November and then when I was formally indicted in April? So I was working for Apple. I mean, I ended up leaving. I resigned. It was clear they're going to permanently remove. They already suspended my clearance.